Hello, my name is Julie, and today I'm going to be talking about the 10 books that I read in February. Reading has been a small struggle for me, even though I actually read a lot this month. I felt like I wasn't reading a lot because two of the books that I read were super long. It has taken more mental energy to read than normal. And maybe that's because I've been having a little bit of a dip in quality of books that I'm reading in the last 6 months. But I am determined to turn it around. While I do have some books that were duds this month, I do have a couple winners. Let's talk about my stats before we get into the books. This is my graphic for my spreadsheet. You can get your own from my Etsy in my link below. I read 10 books for a total of 5,017 pages, and like 2/5 of those pages were only from 2 books. I had an average rating of 3.47, which is an improvement from last month, but is still lower than normal. I had 1 proper 5-star, had an average page count of 501 pages per book, and read 179 pages per day. Even though this was the shortest month, I read a ridiculous amount of pages. I read 4 books from my physical collection and added 2 books to my TBR for an overall annual net TBR of -6. But I think I'm gonna be buying a bunch of new books soon. My star ratings are fairly average except for the fact that I've got a bunch of books in the 2-star category. Unfine. 50% of the books that I read were fantasy and I had a sprinkling otherwise. I read more books in series than I did standalones. Exactly 50% of the books that I read were audiobooks, and I read 70% adult books versus YA. So the first book that I read in February was for my 12 books from 12 friends in 12 months challenge. 12 of my mutuals each gave me a book to read throughout the year, and this month I read The Prison Healer by Lynette Noni. This is a YA fantasy that I'd seen the cover several places, but I would not have read otherwise. So this is about our main character, what's her freaking name? It's like a millennial child. Kiva. Yeah, that's like a white millennial mom child name. You know what I mean? The blonde lady with all the names? Anyway, our main character is Kiva, and she has been a prisoner since she was 10 years old when her and her father were captured. He has since passed, and she has taken on his job of being the healer at the prison. So she does have a little bit of a better life than some of the other people at the prison, and a lot of people hate her for it and hate her for kind of going along with the system because it's her job. But the prison life is being shaken up when the rebel queen, who has a claim to the throne, is brought to the prison on her deathbed, basically unconscious, can't function, and Kiva decides that she is going to take the place of the rebel queen in the deadly trials that the queen would have to participate in to validate her claim. Kiva doesn't have any magical powers, so she shouldn't be able to survive it, but she still thinks it's the right thing to do because it's what her father would have done. Meanwhile, there also seems to be some sort of plague going through the prison. Plus, of course, there's a hot guy. I'm gonna say this with a couple books that I read this month. It didn't do anything positively criminal, but I was bored and I thought this was predictable. I would say that there are 5 main plot twists throughout the book. 2 of them I guessed within the first 2 chapters. 2 of them I guessed from what type of book this is and the type of things that were in the synopsis. And one of the things I didn't guess because I completely was wrong about how I pictured what a character looked like. Having read the synopsis, I was under the impression that it was going to be Kiva working together with this rival queen to try to fix all the things in the prison with the plague and the trials and blah blah blah. And that's not true. The rebel queen is fully out of the picture. So I was like really excited for like a feminist fantasy where it is focusing on 2 women working together, but it's not. Our main character is kind of on her own, and the main other person that she's interacting with is a pretty boring love interest. None of the characters in this book felt like they had a lot of personality. I would say the only person that I really wanted more from was the female guard. I thought she was cool. I did really like that Kiva is a healer. That is a trope that I really like. I like the struggle that she has because she is sort of going along with the system. I like the dilemma that she's faced with being a healer who is partially employed by the prison and how that forces her to do things that she doesn't necessarily want to do. That's a good dilemma. And I also thought it was great that she ends up using the scientific method to try to figure out what the plague is. However, if you've read like any book ever, you know what type of thing the plague is to begin with. I think the main thing that was actually bad about this book is that the trials, which are a good part of what would drive someone to read this book, are so deus ex machina. Our main character doesn't have any magic powers, and they don't manifest or anything, and she basically gets out of it by other people protecting her of their own magic and like things that she doesn't know about. So it just feels like, okay, let's put our character in a deadly situation, but they're not gonna die because I'm gonna give them plot armor. Even though she's supposed to be a really clever character, we never see her use her wiles to get out of a situation, which I feel like would have been way more interesting than just having someone else give her a magical object. And I also just wasn't in love with the dialogue and like the writing style. But yeah, this just wasn't for me, and kind of is an example of why I am turning away from reading a lot of YA fantasy versus the ones that are just really acclaimed. I think it started out with something that could have been original, but it took every turn that it could out of being original. So I ended up giving this like a 2.5 star. The second book that I read in February was The Wedding Date by Jasmine Guillory. This is an author that I've seen around, so I decided to pick it up when the audiobook was available from my library, even though I hadn't had anybody like particularly telling me to read this one. This is about two strangers who get stuck in an elevator together and are immediately smitten with each other. The guy, Drew, who is a pediatric surgeon, is going to the wedding of his ex the next day, and he just broke up with his most recent girlfriend, so he needs a date, and he asks the girl in the elevator, Alexa, who is a Black woman who works for her city, is very passionate about her job, and she just decides, yeah, why not? This guy's hot, I could use a date, why not go out? And they ended up hitting it off so well that even though they are both very focused on their careers and live hours apart, have to fly to each other, they just start seeing each other, but there starts to be a lot of issues with how both of them view their relationship. Here's the thing that I am running into with romance. I don't want to read about something that I don't find desirable. I don't care about like the people's attractiveness, but like if the relationship that they have and the things that they're doing aren't desirable, I'm like, what's the point? And this whole book is about a man who can't commit to a relationship, is not in touch with his emotions, takes his emotions out on other people, runs away from dealing with things, and just actively like doesn't think very well of the people around him when he's the problem. Meanwhile, Alexa is a fantastic character. Alexa is an amazing main character. She is interesting when she is with Drew, and she is interesting when she is on her own and dealing with the program that she is trying to put together with her job. It just drove me crazy that such an awesome woman is getting paired with such a dickhead. Like, he seems attractive and cool at the beginning, but for months on end, he is making this into a situationship. When she is looking for reassurance, he avoids doing that at any cost and does some like things that I think are pretty inappropriate for the situation. Because we see into his mind, we can see how angry he gets about the people around him. To Alexa, he thinks, oh, she's such a bitch, when he is the one who fucked up everything and did something that was really messed up to her. And not to mention, he like actively makes one of the children that is his patient's cry because he's upset about other things. Like, this guy is such an asshole. And it was like a slow burn into him being an asshole. Like, he had secrets up top that he wasn't exactly saying. He wasn't forthcoming about how he's a little bit of a player. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that Drew has dated a bunch of girls. That's a thing that real people experience. They may date casually and then finally meet someone that they want to date seriously. But the fact that he cannot accept that for so long, takes it out on everybody, and just is so immature, made me hate him so much and made me want to make Alexa run away. Otherwise, I didn't think there was a whole lot of plot. Like, every time they hang out, basically the exact same thing happens. One of them flies to the other person, they get fast food and eat it on their couch, and then one of them works on work. They make out or whatever, and then somebody has to fly back. So I'm giving this like a 2.5. Then for my book club, 3 of Clubs, in January, February, and March, we are reading historical fantasy books. You can join us in March when we read The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reed. Link is in the description to get to the club. But in February, we read Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. This has been everywhere on the internet lately, and you know what? I gave into the hype, and I think it actually does pretty much live up to it. It wasn't a brand new favorite of all time, but I thoroughly enjoyed myself. This is a fantasy world that is inspired by World War I. There are these gods who had died but have come back, and 2 of them are at war and have started claiming soldiers from all over to fight for them. And Iris's brother is one of the people that has been claimed to fight for one of the gods, and she has not heard from him since he went off to war and is really worried that he has died. So she starts writing on her typewriter letters to him. Once she's done with them, they end up disappearing. Iris is also a reporter. She is vying for a columnist position with a boy, Roman, who is ultra privileged but just as good of a writer as she is. And they have a little bit of a rivalry, but it turns out that Roman is actually the one who is receiving the letters that are magically disappearing. He decides to write back to her. Even though he knows who she is, he doesn't tell her who he is. So that's a very interesting dramatic irony type thing that we have going on throughout the book. I liked that this was a fantasy world inspired by history, but it's modern history. Most historical fantasy is set in the real world, but with magical elements put into it that are based on the sort of mythology of the area. And less often we have it set in a fantasy world where it is heavily inspired by that mythology. But this is the only book that I've read that does that second one, but it is in modern history instead of like ancient history. I really love the writing style of this. I thought it was beautiful and poetic without being too pretentious. I thought the pacing of this was very good, and I wanted to keep turning the pages. Even though I think that the relationship could have been developed more, regardless, I was very invested and I wanted them to get together. And I think the pace of their relationship makes sense because it is in wartime. The ending, I know some people were really upset that it was a cliffhanger, and I was like, that was exactly where I expected the book to end and the type of note that I thought it was going to end on, so it wasn't surprising to me, but I think it leads well into the next book. And my main complaint, I think, is that I don't feel like we as a reader have a very good grasp on the magic and fantasy part of this world. The magical typewriters feel like a one-off magical realism element that we don't really see any equivalents of, and we don't have a lot of context for what the gods do. The characters don't either, and I expect that we'll learn more about it in the next book, so I am planning on continuing to find out, because I did have a good time with this. So I'm giving this, I think, a 4.25. Really enjoyable, and I think it lives up to the hype it's been getting. Then I read another book by an author that I have given 5 stars to previously because I want to find new 5 stars. But I failed to, and that is Business or Pleasure by Rachel Lynn Solomon. Nobody's more sad about this than me. This is about our main character, Chandler, who is a ghostwriter. She has been writing memoirs for other people. Even though she's new at her job, she has been very successful about it, but is still not fulfilled about it because she's not getting any credit for her work. Uncharacteristically, she ends up having a one-night stand with this hot stranger that she ends up going on a whirlwind date with. When it actually gets to the one-night stand in the bedroom, he is super awkward and bad, and she is having a terrible time, and all she wants to do is get out of there. Turns out the next day that she is surprisingly linked up with a new client for her to ghostwrite with, And it turns out that it's the guy that she just had the terrible one-night stand with the day before. This guy is Finn Walsh, who was in a Teen Wolf-like show when he was younger and is now sort of faded into just doing the con circuit and isn't really acting as much anymore. And when they finally break the ice and talk about the one-night stand that they had, she kind of lets it slip that she didn't have a good time. She decides to give him sex lessons, which I think I missed when I read this synopsis a long time ago when it was announced. The number one thing about this book is that I was bored. I didn't feel attached to any of the characters. I didn't feel like they were very well developed. I didn't care about the relationship and them being together. That I didn't want to see them be together and like fix all these problems because I just didn't care enough. I didn't find Finn particularly attractive. I thought Chandler was a very stock insert yourself here main character. I think there are maybe like 4 or 5 intimate scenes in this book, and only like one of them I thought was desirable or attractive or whatever, or just like worked for me. The other ones I was more like cringing and waiting for it to be over. One conversation that I really did like is how Chandler is struggling with the ghostwriting and wanting to be a writer because she has wanted to be a novelist, but she doesn't feel like making that jump because it's so rare to be an author full time. I think there is a plot point that I was expecting that doesn't happen, and it means that there would be like a big thing like looming over their relationship for the entirety of their relationship that is never resolved. And I just think it's really toxic that it's left the way that it is. There was also like a good amount of like millennial cringe humor, but like I got through this pretty quickly. There were good bones here, but it just didn't do what I wanted it to do and didn't live up to the previous 2 rom-coms of hers. So I'm giving this like another 2.5 stars. Oopsies. Then I listened to the audiobook of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Even though I own the physical copy, I just couldn't have fit it in. This is the origin of the true crime book. In 1959, in Holcomb, Kansas, an entire family was murdered in their home overnight. They didn't have any enemies. They were very beloved by the people in the community. There didn't seem to be any motive for this crime, and there were very few clues as to how to catch the culprits. Truman Capote at the time was working for like the New York Times or a similar magazine, and was assigned to cover this crime. And actually, Harper Lee went with him, who was his childhood best friend, and went to Holcomb to try to investigate the murders. This is described as a nonfiction novel, where he claimed that every single word of it was true, that every piece of dialogue was verbatim, which we know isn't entirely true, but it does very much stick to a lot of the facts of the crime, enough that I don't really have any problems with any veracity of this book. I was expecting Truman Capote to have inserted himself into the book, but he avoids talking about himself at all. I think a lot more recent true crime books, I'm thinking of I'll Be Gone in the Dark, have the author as a character in it where you see what they're trying to do. But I thought it was interesting. He doesn't do that. I thought the writing style was so beautiful and specific, and he just had a really good way with words that made me like pause and want to reread a sentence. Here's the thing. I don't think this crime is that interesting, and a lot of the suspense is taken away. We as the reader know from the very beginning who the people who commit the crime are, what they were wanting. There were just some parts of this book, they were way less interesting than other parts. As a person who has consumed crime-related content in a modern context, the writing is different than what we see today. Because this is mostly nonfiction, I am not rating this, but I thought it was a really interesting book to read for the history of this genre. And I can cross it off my 100 books to read in a lifetime list. Then I listened to A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. This is the conclusion to a cozy sci-fi duology about Dex, who is a tea monk who is disgruntled with their job. In the first book, ends up going out into the wilds by themselves to try to find some peace, and ends up running into a robot who humanity has not seen robots for hundreds of years since they gained consciousness and rebelled and wanted nothing to do with humanity. This robot, Moscap, and Dex interact and have questions for each other about their society and how the other person lives. So in the first book, it is a lot of Dex figuring out things about robots and Moscap, and in this book, Moscap is being brought to the humans, and it has a lot of questions for the humans and Dex. I wish that there were going to be so many more adventures with these two, but I can see that this is a stopping point. If I'm correct, this was actually commissioned by Tor for Becky Chambers to write a solar punk book. These books are very therapy in a book. They are very much about the themes and wanting you, the reader, to think about things about your own life and how you interact with, like, how you talk about yourself, and how we as humans are very stuck in our ways about how we think about ourselves and society. I think that is something that really worked for me, is that this is a very unique way of seeing for maybe a first time that sometimes things that humans do are weird. I really like these characters, I love this setting a lot, and I really like the themes. So I gave it a 4-star. You can finish it in a sitting or two, and I highly recommend it if you want a hot cup of tea in a book. Then I was approved for an e-arc on NetGalley of one of my most anticipated books of the year, and that is Where Sleeping Girls Lie by Farida Abike Amide. This is the author of Ace of Spades, which I believe was the first book that we ever read for my book club, and is like one of my favorite YA books that I've ever read. In this book, we follow our main character, Sade, who is now an orphan after her father, who wasn't very kind to her, has passed away, and she has been sent to this elite boarding school that doesn't immediately accept her, and her roommate goes missing, and she is trying to figure out what happened to her and what is behind it. The first half of this book I didn't really like. The second half I think is far better than the first half. The first half, I thought there were so many cliches, like so many like boring characters, like dialogue I didn't really get, things that I thought were like ripoffs of other things. And in the second half, it got more into what I was expecting from the book, having read Ace of Spades. The types of themes that we're interrogating, I did like, but I thought that could have been like a larger part of the book. I didn't think all the characters were being very smart about how they were going about things. For example, our main character finds a sheet of what is very obviously Morse code and doesn't immediately think, A, that's Morse code, B, I should take this piece of paper, so I should solve it. I think every single human being should be able to identify what Morse code is, because obviously if you're in a book, it's so fucking important. I think the main difference between these two books is that I did not feel connected to Sade or any of the side characters at all, compared to I would die for the main characters of Ace of Spades. I felt like they were much more fleshed out, and I think that's partially because Sade is not sharing a lot of herself to the reader until later. And I think that that kind of reveal type stuff was done in a much more predictable way. I think a lot of the themes and what the book has to say is great, but the plot holding it up and the characters didn't really do as much for me. So I gave it a 3-star. I would recommend it if it was something that somebody was looking for, but I would be more hesitant to give it to adult readers versus Ace of Spades, I think can be read by adults as well. Not to completely compare the author's two books, but the way that they are set up, I think it's hard not to. Then I listened to the 6th book in the Wheel of Time, which is Lord of Chaos by Robert Jordan. Why am I still reading these books? I gave the first book 5 stars and was like, this is gonna be a new favorite thing. And then no other book has lived up to how much I love that first book. But I have several people in my life now who have read Wheel of Time who I can talk about it with, and they're free from my library. So I'm like, hey, if I really wanna listen to a chunky audiobook, might as well. The weird thing about this series for me is I have enjoyed the odd numbered books much more than I have enjoyed the even number books. Compared to previous books, this feels like not a lot happened. We have so many characters that we're bouncing between in this one, but we don't have as much going on. There's definitely a thing that happens with Egwene that was like jaw drop on the floor. What the hell is happening? But I think a lot of the plot lines in this didn't work for me. Every single one of the romances in this book like doesn't work for me. As always, how the men and the women interact with each other and the gender essentialism that is just baked into the narrative of this book bothers me so much. But you know what's more of a crime? Being boring. I don't think in 2 months I could tell you a damn thing that happened in this book except for that one thing with Egwene. There are things that I like about this series. Some of the magic stuff's cool. A lot of different like world building things that are going on are interesting. I think Rand having Lews Therin in his mind is interesting at this point, but there's just so much that doesn't interest me or I actively dislike. Usually people say books 7 through 10 are the worst books in the series. So I'm like, I already wasn't like obsessed. Am I going to make it through the slog? What to do? Who knows? So giving this like a 3. Then the last audiobook that I listened to was A Master of Djinn by P. Djeli Clark, a lightly steampunk historical fantasy set in 1912 Cairo, and we have a magic system themed around that mythology of Jinn and Ifrit, Seal of Suleiman, and that sort of thing that's very similar. If you've read City of Brass, it's the same theme of mythology. Our main character works for the Ministry of Alchemical and Supernatural Entities and is essentially trying to make sure that all the magical things that are happening in the city of Cairo are under control. So 60 years ago, there was this man called Al-Jahiz who ended up unlocking the door between the magical world and the real world, and the magical world has been living with the real world ever since. And now, 60 years later, a new figure who calls himself Al-Jahiz is terrorizing the city. Our main character, Fatma, is trying to investigate what is going on alongside her brand new partner, Hadia, who's very different from her and is kind of getting in her way. I really liked the flavor of this book, how we have this light steampunk thing going on top of a established magic that is ancient and also in this urban setting of 1912 Cairo. I also like that we have the serious parts of a fantasy mixed with the occasional comedic jab from the author and the characters that just makes a pretty unique tone that I ended up really liking. So I was going into this thinking there was going to be a much bigger like plot that was going to get revealed and we're gonna like continue following these characters, but no, it just wraps up at the end. I don't know, I really liked our main characters. I love how they interact with each other, and I liked the investigative process and just generally had a good time. I also thought that this audiobook was narrated fantastically, so I ended up giving this a 4-star. And the final book that I read in February, the book that I spent half the month working on, was Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive, the penultimate in this arc of the series, with the last book of it coming out in December, so I'm all caught up. This is a big old chunky fantasy with a lot of different perspectives of people who come from different walks of life on this planet where storms are constantly ravaging the landscape and have really affected how this world is different from ours. All of these different people are coming upon an ancient magic as an apocalyptic event seems to be coming up. And in this 4th book, the enemy is bigger and badder than ever. And a lot of our characters are at really low points emotionally and are trying to overcome that while they are also trying to survive and make sure that humanity and life as we know it on the planet isn't entirely doomed. I tabbed Oathbringer up when there were a lot of quotes that I liked from the book that I wanted to remember, but also whenever there was like lore things that could be connected to the Cosmere. And in this book, we have almost all of these are Cosmere related things. There were fewer like quotes or moments for the characters that I decided to tab up, except for maybe at the end. This is still my favorite series. I still gave this a 5-star and I enjoyed a good amount of it, but I thought I was less consistently in love with it as we went through the book. The first half is slow for a Stormlight until like the halfway point where something happens and we more pick up into the correct gear. I think my favorite part of this book was Navani, where she is being such a woman in STEM and figuring out so many like engineering and scientific things. And I liked how we're getting more of the physical mechanics of how the magic in this world works. I took so long with this. I really wanted to get as much out of it as I could. I accidentally spoiled myself on the Wikipedia for something that's going to happen in the future, which sucks, but I overall am still so obsessed with this series. Even if not all of the character journeys were my favorite that we've seen so far, I think every single one of them had a moment or two that I thought was pretty profound. I also wanted to see more from Dalinar, which we didn't see, but that's okay. Finally, my first 5-star of 2024, which is depressing, which means that I am going to have to go on a journey of trying to find more 5 stars, and you'll just have to come on that with me. I'll probably be doing that in my next video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, let me know what you read in February. What were your favorites? What were your least favorites? If you read anything that I've read here, I'd love to talk about the book with you. If you'd like to follow me anywhere, my Instagram, my Goodreads, my Etsy, where I sell reader spreadsheets and bookish crochet dolls, or if you'd like to join my book club, all of those links are in the singular link down below. And as always, I will see you in the next one.